without further ado, I'm just going to talk to you about Dr. Debra Kidd, who is a friend of Discovery Education and a brilliant and highly experienced teacher and a friend to many, many schools across the country and beyond, I know. So we're very lucky to have her today, that we're going to be able to talk to Debra about her ideas around enriching the curriculum, which I know is something that is very much a specialist subject for Debra. So it just remains for me to welcome you, Debra. I hope you're there.
I am indeed, Andrew. Hello.
There we are. The technology works. We never quite know on days like today, do we? But it's great. It's great to see you. And thank you for joining us today. And it looks like you've got some sunshine behind you, I think.
Oh, no, I think that might be a bit misleading. We've had a very rainy day up here today.
Yeah, it's quite patchy at the moment, isn't it? One never really knows what it's like, but it gives us all something to talk about. Well, just for the benefit of those on the call who perhaps aren't familiar with your work, I'm sure they are, but just in case, why don't you tell us a little bit about your professional role and your journey to date? Is that okay?
Yes. I think my career journey has been based on the advice I read when I was about 8 years old of how to evade a crocodile attack. And that was basically to run in zigzags, I was told. And that has pretty much been taken to heart in my career. I started off, well, before I went into teaching, I started off working in advertising. And then I went into teaching at sixth form level. My first job was in a sixth form, teaching English and drama, which I loved, but I'd always intended to teach younger children. So I moved into secondary, where I thought my comfort zone was definitely GCSE and A-level. That was pretty much where I was focused. And I found myself in a position where I was asked to take on a transition project, which involved going into primary school in year 6. And I suddenly had a revelation that actually I really liked primary. So I've ended up bouncing between the two throughout my career and to university. You know, I currently work independently, but also with Leeds Beckett University, looking after their trainee teachers. So I feel like I've taught every age group, literally from 3-year-olds up to, 40, 50-year-olds doing their maths.
I think that's such an advantage for the people whom you work with now, because you know the destination, you know where they've come from, you can see that whole continuum. And I think that's especially important and brings value to the advice that you give, doesn't it? It must do, because you work with them.
It does. And you know what you realise is that we don't really change that much. We all like to be engaged in our learning. We all like to feel it has purpose. We all like to feel we're valued in that process. And it doesn't matter whether you're 3 or 13 or 33. That's a fairly central plank of what we need to think about.
Yeah, good point. Good point. I'm not absolutely convinced that my character has substantially changed since I was 8, to be honest with you.
I would say, having spent a bit of time with you, Andrew, I'd agree.
I really don't think it has. I don't do cynicism, things like that. I'm terribly gullible, Anyway, enough about me.
That's a good thing, I think.
It's a good thing, I think so. Enough about me. So how might you define this interesting word curriculum? And could you summarize for me perhaps the historical context of the curriculum that we've ended up with today? How did we get here, Debra?
Well, I mean, the roots of the word curriculum simply mean to run a course and effectively to get from A to B. And we've taken that route and applied it to an educational process. I think in a way that has become a bit diminished. So we tend to reduce curriculum now down to an exam syllabus or to the national curriculum. And of course, before the national curriculum came in, I think in 1988, we didn't have a standardized curriculum. Schools effectively decided for themselves what children would study and how they'd study it, and how much there would be of maths or how much there would be of other things. And, the desire to create some kind of standardized curriculum came from a feeling at government level that there was no consistency. But the problem is, as soon as you impose a system onto a system, it tends to diminish and reduce what people were doing. So they start to think, oh, this is what we have to teach. And this is all we have to teach. And as long as we tick off and cover certain things, then everything else is just a little glossy add-on, but it doesn't really matter. I don't think all schools feel like that, but I think there's a danger that that's what's happened in our approach to curriculum.
Wow, that's so interesting. And the idea that, well, first of all, the idea that, you know, before the national curriculum, schools were the judge and jury of what it is they teach. They have some autonomy and freedom. Seems wholly alien now. And equally, the idea that the national curriculum was not intended to be the only curriculum, the curriculum, again, really gives one pause for thought, I think, really. And how, in your view, perhaps might we enrich the curriculum at the same time delivering the syllabus required for statutory exams and meeting external accountability measures? Is there some tension there, and what are some of the challenges around that? Have to do both.
There's certainly tension there. We have a situation where the test is the tail that wags the dog,
right.
And what we tend to do is to look at the end point of that test, whether it's SATs,
Right.
whether it's GCSE, whether it's A-level, and then back plan from there.
Right.
And feel like as long as we've covered and got a clear progression of skills and knowledge that leads us to that end point, then we've covered the curriculum.
Right.
And in doing so, we sometimes forget to think about the age appropriateness of what we're doing. So we're seeing a lot of pressure loaded onto early years education at the moment, which is entirely inappropriate for the age of development of children.
Right.
It comes from a panic of, well, by the age of 11, they must be here. By the age of 16, they must be here. And a lot of that is obviously also driven by accountability measures and feeling like you must tick boxes that Ofsted are looking for. And I know we'll unpick some of this as we go through a little bit later about the level of autonomy that schools and teachers actually have in the face of that. But I think we also have to bear in mind that we are always going to be a square peg trying to fit into a round hole when it comes to exams, because the exams assume that every single child on the same day at the same time will be in the same condition to sit a test and show that they can achieve a certain amount. And one of the really interesting things, depressingly interesting things we discovered last year during the pandemic, when we had the CAG fiasco for GCSEs and A-levels, is that written into the system is an assumption that every single year 40% of children will fail through circumstances on the day, whether that's because they've just, their girlfriends just dumped them, their dog died, they had really terrible hay fever that day, they forgot to turn over the paper and read the question on the back of the paper, which is what I did. In that situation, the system builds in that expectation. But then when we had teachers putting in grades, teachers wouldn't do that because they were basing it on the standard of work that had been coming in from students for the whole year. And at that point, we've got to start asking ourselves, what are we doing and who are we doing it for? And I'm not convinced we can put our hands on our hearts and say we're doing this in the best interests of children. So we can't change, I can't, you can't, a head teacher, a teacher on the ground can't change the current exam system. We can push and we can ask for change and we can lobby. But what we have to start doing on the ground is mitigating against those circumstances and giving children the kinds of opportunities that even if they have a bad day on the day of the exam, they've got the oracy skills to impress in an interview. They've got the confidence to apply for things. They've got the wherewithal to find another route, another pathway through. And that's what I think is an enriching curriculum really needs to focus on, allowing children to see that this end exam isn't the be all and end all of their lives.
It's not, and the sum of the grades that they achieve in response to those exams don't in any way, they're not an accurate measure of them as a learner, is it? They're not, they never were.
No, they're not. No.
The way you put it, you have this uncanny, brilliant knack of stating something which seems so obvious now I think about it, but we weren't thinking it until you said it. And I think that's your knack. And to position it like that for the system of grading to work, by definition, really, sorting and ranking, it requires 30-40% of the cohort not to pass. And what an odd thing to assume will happen.
And but historically, that is pretty much what has happened.
Yeah.
So effectively, what you end up is with a mathematical formula that predicts future success.
Right.
And we have this now in Progress 8. It's embedded into Progress 8. It's embedded into, you know, the assumption that what you achieve at the age of 11 will predict your outcomes at the age of 16. We have all these formula, all these systems driven by this absolutely deadening desire for certainty. We just want to be in control. We want to be certain. We want to remove bias. We want to remove any kinds of, you know, weird anomalies that might fly up. And in order to do that, you know, there's a cost. And that cost is very real and very human for a lot of children.
Wow. So do you, I mean, you work with schools all over the country and abroad in a range of different issues, I know, drawing on your own experience, but curriculum is certainly something where you bring so much added value. So you obviously attach a lot of importance to it. Do you see curriculum as a great leveler, potentially, or can it risk deepening social and educational equality? You know, how do we build inclusive content and maintain parity provision at the same time? Can we do that? Yeah. Is it ever achievable?
It is achievable, and many schools are doing it. Curriculum is not what you're given, it's what you make. And when I talk about, what I talk about in a curriculum of hope is that we have to bring a positivity, a sense of empowerment to that process, because otherwise, I mean, just listen to what I've just talked about for the last 15 minutes, it could be really depressing. And then when we think of the content of the curriculum for children, you know, when we say it's really important they understand about climate change and that they understand about equity and they understand about race and they understand about extinction crises and they understand potentially we could be creating a curriculum of trauma. And so although it is important that children know these things, unless we position them in a place where they feel empowered to find solutions to the problems we're presenting to them, it becomes a very, very debilitating curriculum. It becomes a kind of, what's the point? We're doomed. Why should we bother curriculum? Now, we can approach that in two ways. We can either avoid the difficult questions and just focus on maths mastery and phonics and reading and pretend everything else isn't happening. Or we can, you know, still cover the maths and the phonics and the reading, which are important. And we can say these things are critical, that, you know, things that our children need to know. So are other things, but we do it in a way that children feel they can take direct action. And that means we have to shift not just our curriculum, but we have to shift our pedagogy, and we have to think about the experiences we offer children. And I know I've spoken with you before, Andrew, about the Chester Zoo project in the northwest of England, where 85 schools now and about 23,000 children have become passionate conservationists. They've worked with the zoo, they've persuaded the city to become the world's first sustainable palm oil city. They liaised with the CEO of Iceland and got him to change his policy. They've planted hundreds of trees, they've created beehives, they've done so many things, and every single thing says to a child, this matters, you matter, and you can do something about it. You can be part of the solution. And I think that's really critical.
And that school that you refer to, that you worked with and so forth, they're smashing the grades as well?
Yeah.
That's not cynical. That sounded cynical. I'm not.
No, because if you approach a curriculum in a way that says, in order for children to feel they have this empowerment, they have to have the language skills, they have to have the knowledge, they have to be able to articulate their position, argue their case. Every single one of those things helps you in an exam.
Yeah, of course.
And you know, it's developing and broadening and deepening your subject knowledge. It's giving you a purpose to apply that subject knowledge, and it's giving you a sense that you have, you know, a place in the world here and now. Whereas too often what we do with children is say, you need to work really hard now in order to achieve X, Y, and Z in the future. And children don't tend to be very future orientated.
No, of course they're not.
Whereas if we say you need this knowledge now to achieve this here and now in your present time, and that will impact on your future, that is so much more powerful, I think.
So although a curriculum, when I think of the word curriculum, I think of a ring binder, you're not saying curriculum is a syllabus. per se. You're saying it's an experience. It's a learning. It's a learning. Do you see what I mean? There's a difference. Well, of course, there's a huge difference.
It lives within you. It's lived and breathed and experienced. Otherwise, it's just a cold, dead document on a shelf. That's all it is.
Yeah.
And until it has life, you know, in it, and it's experienced by children, it's nothing except an intention. So, and I think we have to, you know, when I'm talking with schools and we're planning curriculum, I focus on 5 key areas. You know, and content credibility is one of them. Yes, we need knowledge. You know, no one in their right mind would say children don't need to know stuff because they can just look it up on Google. They need to know stuff, but they also need to know how to apply it. There needs to be coherence. So they need to understand not just, you know, how one step of learning leads on to another, which is kind of Ofsted's concept of coherence, but also they need to have coherence of ideas, how things bump into each other, how complex the world is. I'm thinking of some primary school children who were looking at Indonesian songbirds and how the songbirds are disappearing from the forest. And one of the reasons the songbirds are disappearing from the forest is because people like to keep them as pets on the verandas. And it's a status symbol. You know, it says every Indonesian man needs a wife, a house, a horse, a dagger, and a songbird. And it's a tradition. So the children, you know, are debating how we should, you know, approach this problem. And one of the children, you know, this is a sort of 9-year-old child, is saying, we can't just go to Indonesia. I mean, they're not going anyway, but we can't liaise with these people in Indonesia and say to them, your traditions are wrong and you have to change them. That would be like them saying to us, we have to change Christmas. So they're starting to see that there's this kind of complexity. And then they start to understand how dependent some people are on the songbirds for their local economy, and how without the songbirds at the market, an entire infrastructure falls apart in terms of economy. The children then have to think, well, what do you replace that with? If we want to protect the songbirds, how do we also protect the people?
Wow.
And that kind of coherent thinking, that thinking about bringing together thinking about conservation, but also bringing together thinking about land use and human geography, is how we start plotting the curriculum in a very coherent way. And then I talk about, you know, creativity being something that is about fluency. So it's about being able to take your knowledge that you've gained and apply it in an unfamiliar context, to make something new of it. And I also, so, you know, we've had then, you know, the content and the coherence and the creativity. And I would add to that compassion. And that's about the curriculum, not just getting children to be compassionate towards others, although that's really important, but it's about the curriculum being compassionate towards children. And that's what I mean by that kind of empowering curriculum, one that isn't a curriculum for trauma, one that makes them feel they have agency in the world. Also, one that doesn't, you know, drag them out of arts and sports activities for extra English and maths, because we know that those activities are good for their mental health. You know, there are all kinds of ways we sometimes are, you know, not very compassionate in the way that we approach children's curriculum. And then finally, community. And are we really making the best of our community and what it offers? Are the children empowered to go and talk to their local council, to lobby them, to influence decisions? Do they work with whatever is available in their local area, Chester Zoo or museums or galleries or theatres? And I don't just mean having a day trip to the pantomime at Christmas. I mean, work with them on the ground. You know, who in our communities can help us meet the Gatsby benchmarks? You know, that's particular an issue in careers education for secondary, but also in primary. There's an expectation that children are introduced to the world of work and the possibilities that exist within that world of work. And those people exist within our communities. So to what extent are we bringing them in to enrich the experiences that children have? And how open are our doors, really? Because quite often secondary schools in particular can be quite closed off places for the local community.
When you talk about secondary schools, another C that you wouldn't want to add to your 5 Cs, I suppose, is compartmentalized. And it seems the cross-curricular links, if you like, to use a good, I was going to say, I was a primary head teacher, so I love that cross. Are they achievable? Can that be achieved? I mean, you've taught every age group, but can you do those cross-curricular links? Is it still compartmentalized?
You can, but it's harder.
Yeah.
And I think people often underestimate how, you know, stressful life is for a lot of secondary school teachers, who, especially the ones who, you know, aren't core subjects, the ones who might be dealing with 450 kids, trying to remember their names, mark their work, assess them, even just recognize their faces. It can be really tricky. But I think where there are natural crossovers, and I can give you an example from year 8, for you know, just one project I was involved in.
Right.
It's years, and it date, well, when I tell you the story, it will date it, because you'll know from the event we looked at. A few years ago, a head teacher that I was working with or for suggested that it would be really good to prove to staff that we could do more cross-curricular work, and if English, maths and science could do it by connecting together, anyone could do it.
Right.
So kind of threw that challenge into my lap. And so I found myself sitting around a table with science and maths colleagues. I was an English teacher, sitting around a table and going, right, okay, who's up for this? And not everyone was. So then we looked at who was up for it, which groups we happened to share, and we decided we'd try it out with them. So it was almost accidental how the groups were chosen, through just fate of timetabling and staffing. So we ended up with a few year 8 groups who had the same teacher for English, you know, for English, maths and science. And we sat down and we said, well, what would we normally be teaching now? Let's not make lots of extra work for ourselves. What would we be teaching now? Now, English and maths, in a way, tend to be easier to do that with, because, you know, we tend to be fairly context free unless you're studying a particular text and it's literature. But within language, you know, we were looking at writing to instruct, writing to persuade, and we were looking at much more technical skills. In maths, thankfully, they were looking at data handling, because I'm not sure what we'd have done if it was quadratic equations or algebra or something, but we would have come up with something.
Yeah, you would have done.
We would have. But the context came from science, because they were looking at waterborne diseases. And so then we looked and said, who in the world needs to know about waterborne diseases right now, in this world, in this moment in time? And how would writing and communicating and using data help them? So that was our question. And we looked at each other and we all just went Haiti, because there'd been a huge earthquake in Haiti. There were about 1 million displaced refugees. It was a few months after the earthquake, and the World Health Organization had just issued a warning that an impending catastrophe was about to come, because all the people living there had been building ditches for latrines up the hillside. And of course, once the rainy season arrived, that was all that sewage was just going to rush down through the refugee camp. So we've got our context, we've got our real world context. And we said, okay, so if these children were placed in the role of aid agency workers, trainee aid agency workers, who have been given the task by the World Health Organization to present information to people on the ground in Haiti about the dangers of this waterborne disease and how to avoid it, that's our context. And we don't have to be massively planning together, because when they come to me in English, we'll be a PR agency, and I'll be teaching them the techniques they need to put into their texts. When they go to maths, they're going to the Office for National Statistics, and their maths teacher is going to teach them the data handling. And when they go to science, they're going to the Centre for Disease Control, and their science teacher is going to do all the experiments, teach them all the knowledge, but with the context all the time that they are professional adults who need to know this stuff to save lives. Now, that little context elevated behaviour. We started noticing that I noticed in one class, 2 boys were bubbling up a little bit, and one of the girls turned around and said, "Oh, stop being unprofessional," she said. we're Skyping the World Health Organization in half an hour. Yeah. And she said, "So you best crack on." She just took on the role of the manager, and she sorted them out and got them working. I didn't have to do anything. I noticed that they were really reaching for that tier 2 vocabulary, that kind of more sophisticated vocabulary, because they wanted to be perceived as professional adults. And that was really important. And then, you know, they just their investment, they wanted to stay behind at lunch times, after school. Some of the children translated their text into French because they went away and found out that Haiti, that's the national language in Haiti. So they thought, what's the point in writing in English? You know, the quality of work was excellent. And really interestingly, in the end of year test, so months later, when they did their end of year test to, you know, be put into sets for year 9, they weren't in sets, they were in mixed ability groups in year 7 and 8. The children who'd taken part in that project, adjusting for value added, ended up in higher sets. And of course, once you get into a higher set, you don't tend to get dropped out from it. So the effect followed them through into their GCSEs almost accidentally, just because they did well at the end, in the end of year test. Now that says a lot about setting, I think. It throws some big questions up about setting.
Yeah, it does.
But it was really clear just in that one simple example that in a secondary school, it's perfectly possible to build these cross-curricular links without impeding or creating real logistical nightmares for teachers.
So what was it that turbocharged the learning for them? Was it the context? Was it the fact that they were learning in role? Was it the fact that they had opportunities to make links in other classrooms, in other subjects, and it kind of just came together? Was it all of those things, I suppose?
I think it was a combination. There was an element of novelty, and children like novelty, and novelty switches the brain into an attentive mode. But yeah, there were the connections, there was the coherence across 3 core subjects.
Yeah, that's the coherence.
And they felt like they were being treated as adults. They were being spoken to as if they were adults. They were being given, you know, jugs of water in class as if they were at a professional meeting. Little things like this. It just elevated the way that they engaged with the work. So there was a playfulness to it, but I think that probably the biggest thing was the purposefulness of it. They cared about these people in Haiti, so much so actually that off their own bats and in their own time, they went off and raised loads of money for them, but without being asked. So there was the effective thing.
It was real in that respect. It wasn't a fictional scenario. It was real because it had real effects and impact on the people that they were studying. I mean, yeah. And that was secondary. This is not primary. This is year 8.
This is year 8. Yeah. It's much easier to do it in primary because, you know, one teacher's in control of things, but it's certainly possible in secondary. I could share, we haven't got time for it, but I could share with you lots of secondary examples.
Yeah, I like that. Well, we were lucky to, I was very lucky to work with you on the Pathway CPD program that we just launched, and you designed and presented your own course within that called A Curriculum of Hope. And you did mention it briefly. Why did you call it that? What does that, because I've heard you talk about curriculum of hope quite a bit. What does that phrase mean to you? Why is that so important?
I think it's because it goes back to what I just said about the importance of giving children a sense that the world is a hopeful place, in spite of all the terrible things that are happening in it. It is still a very hopeful place, and children need to see that hope embedded in their curriculum. And I talked about the outcomes of the Haiti work. The children raised money. The outcomes of the Chester Zoo work. Children feel like they've genuinely made a change in terms of conservation. And I think that's hugely important, that children can see impact from their work. But it's also a curriculum of hope for teachers, because I think one of the things that teachers have found the hardest, in terms of, we've got a retention crisis, not just a recruitment crisis in teaching, but a retention crisis. I think one of the things we find hardest is being cut off from our core sense of purpose, when the reasons we went into teaching, which are almost entirely altruistic. If you ask people why they're going to teach, they like children or they like subjects and they want to inspire children to like their subjects, but they're altruistic motives. When you start to feel that you've been cut off from that purpose and that your time's being spent filling in spreadsheets or dealing with admin or bureaucracy, or you feel that in spite of your best efforts, you are fighting the system, because not all children have the same starting point when we start curriculum off, then you can become very disillusioned very quickly. And I think a curriculum of hope is about finding that inbuilt pedagogical activist in you, you know, switching on your professional imagination again, and knowing that when the door is shut, you know, and no one's watching except for these 30 people in front of you, your responsibility is to them. It's not to your MAT policy, it's not to Ofsted, it's not to, you know, the spreadsheet, it's to them. And there's a lot of hope in that, because there's a lot of positivity in that.
That's terrific default setting to have for your work around curriculum, isn't it, to be hopeful? And the introduction of that film, if you remember, on that bright sunny day, I have a feeling it was the time when both of us had finally managed to venture out in between lockdowns, if you remember. It wasn't, it was the first day that we both had out. You set it at a racetrack. Why did you do that? Do you want to talk? Because it was such a brilliant analogy, I thought.
Well, it was an analogy I picked up from Mick Waters, brilliant Mick Waters, who used to be the head of QCA many years ago, and now still he's working with the Welsh government at the moment on their curriculum. And he'd talked about, you know, there are no staggered starts in education, and it really got me thinking about that. You know, what are the disadvantages that children come with? So when we started that Pathways film, we did it on a racetrack so that we could just have this visual of, you know, here's a child whose mum and dad will pay for private tuition. Here's a child who has access to the circle of influence where they've taken part in, you know, football clubs and drama clubs and brownies and scouts and guides, all those things that place them further along the track in terms of advantage. And yet we have a system that insists that every child begins at the same point, ends at the same point on the same day, and almost it pretends that these disadvantages don't exist. All they say to teachers is you have to close the gap. You have to close the gap, and you have to make them run faster, and you have to make them get there faster, and you have to make them catch up. But we don't tell them how, we just expect it to happen.
And those, as you brilliantly said in the film, who are starting, as you say, it's not a staggered start to make allowances for whether you're in the inside lane or the outside lane. Effectively, from a curriculum point of view, they're all starting there. And of course, some have, well, frankly, further to run than others, absolutely, even just to get to where they needed to be. Yeah,
they've got further to run and are hampered by, you know, various other things as well. You know, it's not an equitable system that we have, and we're too keen to close our eyes to that inequality in our system, I think.
Well, let's finish with hope, as you always do. And so as we look ahead to the new academic year, which may seem some distance off, but of course it's not, it'll be here very soon. What 3 pieces of advice might you give teachers and leaders who are listening today? 3 achievable steps, if you like, to make a small change, an improvement here and there to the curriculum that they have in their school. Where do we start?
I think you start with shifting your mindset, and you shift your mindset to that, not what are those people staring at me on the outside thinking and expecting. You shift your mindset to the children sitting in front of you. What do they need? You know, where would I be putting them on that racing track? Where would I be putting those children? And what do I need to do to try and make that more equitable? And that is not as difficult as you think. I think if you place children into purposeful contexts, you bring learning to life for them. You always, no matter how difficult they are and how hard it is, and believe me, I've sat there with my head in my hands weeping after year 9 classes myself. We've all been there.
You've earned your stripes.
You never let them see that. You never let them know that you think anything other than they are amazing and that they are going to be brilliant, and you have faith in them. And it's really rewarding when you see kids 20 years later. I had a boy once who had been the bane of my life, and it was an awful year. And when they left, when I finished teaching that class and they were going off to another teacher the following year, I cracked open a bottle of champagne. I was so excited to get rid of them. And yet I came off a train. I came off a train in the dark one night, and there were a bunch of lads standing there, and I kind of did that swerve around them. And then I heard in the dark the word "miss." When I turned around, And there he was. And he went, "You're not walking home on your own, are you?" And I said, "Oh, yes." He said, "No." And he walked me home. And he walked me home. And when he got me to the bottom of my drive, I said, "Oh, thank you. That was so kind of you." And he said, "You never gave up on me." And then he just turned and walked off. And, you know, I think that's really important. So that's a long way to say, focus on the kids in front of you and try and think about what they need, and recognize you won't always get the reward back immediately. It doesn't always come straight away. And then the second thing for leaders, probably more, is identify what your breakable plates are. And I get that from David Cameron, not the old...
No, the real David Cameron.
I need to be very careful about how I not the old Prime Minister. Yeah, the real David Cameron, a Scottish educator. He says that we can't come into school with lots of new ideas for teachers. Oh, we're going to liaise with a zoo, we're going to liaise with a museum, we're going to build this project about Haiti, we're going to do all these exciting things, if you don't release them from some other burden. You can't keep placing extra work onto teachers. So what administrative task are you going to take off them? How are you going to shift meeting times so that they've got the time to think this through and to connect with people? That's really vital. And you won't get buy-in from staff for new initiatives unless you just create some space.
Just another thing to carry, isn't it?
Yeah, people just get overloaded, and then, you know, they become resentful, you lose that goodwill. And then I think finally, you know, and this is pertinent for now, it's don't fall into this trap. We are being pushed into a trap of catching up from lost learning in the pandemic, I mean, there are ridiculous things being thrown around. Amanda Spielman saying we've lost 40,000 years of learning, and, you know, I think it was the I don't know, the International Bank or somebody talking about £40,000 worth of lost income, you know, for each individual child in the future. I mean, spurious, poorly evidenced claims that are creating panic amongst teachers, children and parents.
Yeah, of course it is.
We just can't do that. So I think we've got to be really careful and think, what have they really missed out on? They've missed out on time with friends. They've missed out on relationships. They've missed out on experiences and travel and going to different places. They've missed out a lot on play, especially if they've been cooped indoors. And then they've probably missed out on that kind of sort of formal level of language that goes beyond the informal family environment. So we need to focus on those things. And if we focus on those things, the other stuff will follow. And I think that's something we really need to bear in mind right now, because that's more hopeful, isn't it?
It's more hopeful. And I must say, you're so courageous. I kind of picked that up. I think that you don't just give schools the benefits of your experience and knowledge and the doctoral work that you've done and all that stuff, which is hugely valuable. I think you actually kind of empower them to be courageous, because that's what I've been hearing during this half hour. It's kind of, you're kind of saying, be courageous to enrich the curriculum as much as you can, because you can still, as you said at the top, I think the other things will follow. If you provide a purposeful context, you said, which I think is key, isn't it? I think everything else will follow, because you're building investment, aren't you? The children are investing in what you're giving them.
Yeah. And people, and you know, we go back to that conversation we had right at the beginning of this. If people feel like they have a sense of purpose, that they are able to master things, that they have some autonomy, they're trusted, they tend to perform really well. And that's as true for children as it is for adults.
For both, yeah. Brilliant. Well, how do people get in touch with you? Because if I was still a head teacher, which sadly I'm not, but if I were, I'd want to get in touch with you. How do we do that? Because I know you've probably got a packed diary, but you might have a day here or there. I do have a packed diary, and things are really picking up at the moment, because I think people are feeling like there's hope on the horizon. Good. I'm actually I'm changing my website at the moment, so there's no point in me giving you a website address, but you can usually catch me on Twitter at Debra Kidd. We've got that. Thank you, Bobby. Ignore the fact that I'm nearly always arguing on there. I mean, you know, you have an opinion, which is one of the reasons we love you. You see, because you have an opinion on stuff. You're courageous enough to call it out when it's nonsense. Well, I don't know. I think I'm just a bit narky. Maybe a bit. I'm from Burnley in Lancashire, so there you go. And
My email address is debrakid68@gmail.com. So I'm sure
Terrific,
Bobby can
thank you.
send that out. And if people want to drop me an email, that's fine.
Great, great. And you're on, and thank you, Bobby, for posting that in the chat at Debra Kidd on Twitter, where you can follow and read all of Debra's fascinating provocations, and they're brilliant. Really, really interesting comments. Yeah. Well, we've been very lucky to have 45 minutes of you today. So it's been a real treat, actually. And thank you ever so much for joining us. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day and a nice cup of tea when you get a chance. Thank you ever so much.
Thank you so much. Goodbye now.